Hey, welcome to Shop Talk with Brandy and James.
We talk about all things related to mental health and cross-cultural workers.
Thanks for joining us, and welcome to Season 3.
Here we go.
Well, welcome to Shop Talk. And our special guest here today, James Kobe, back by popular demand. So a lot of people wrote and said they wanted you back on the show, so which I'm glad since, you're the co-host. So what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk a little bit about a chapter that I wrote for a new book out called The Essentials of People Care and Development, and a presentation I gave on trauma-informed staff care.
Great. So you wrote the book? Is that what you're saying?
I did not.
Okay.
But it is a compilation that was edited by Jeff Whiteman and Heather Pubels, who we've had on the podcast, and need to have Heather on as well sometimes. She's a chief editor for EMQ, which is a journal.
What does that stand for?
It is Evangelical Missions Quarterly.
So tell us about the book, and tell us about your involvement in the book, and just why trauma-informed staff care is important.
So the book kind of came out of Missio Nexus, which is an organization that really pulls together organizations and churches and resources, in particular the people care and development track. So a lot of the contributions were on issues related to how we care for staff. So everything from doing member care well to how to have a good sabbatical, which is a particular experience that we think a lot about in education. Professors will have sabbaticals every 7 years, but how there's actually some really helpful ways to implement that into an organization, and even some research that has been done recently by our buddy Jeff Whiteman. So lots of good stuff. The thing that I was asked to do was to talk about trauma. And as a trauma therapist, it's something that I do a lot of. Particularly, how can we as staff care and as organizations be a little more attentive to people's experiences? So I think in general, we understand when there's been a big crisis, somebody's been evacuated, they've been held up, they've been robbed, they've had an unexpected death of somebody close to them. I think in general, we do better at responding to those types of things. Trauma-informed staff care is also being attentive to the fact that most people have had difficult, if not traumatic, experiences in their life. And because of that, they are more likely to be triggered or to have memories of those events brought up to them.
So you come in, like as a staff care, you come into the situation not as like a blank slate. You bring your own experiences into the situation when you're providing staff care. And like you said, we've talked about trauma on our podcast before, but I think it is important to think about the staff care and how they can prepare themselves when they're interacting with someone who's experienced trauma.
And if I were to broaden it, I would also say leaders in organizations. A lot of times as a counselor, I'm coming in and I'm sometimes coaching or consulting a leader, but maybe providing counseling for somebody who's going through a difficult experience. And I'm actually watching the leader unintentionally do things that are really triggering and really impacting individuals. They have no idea that because I said this thing or did this a particular way, that it's actually creating within this person a very defensive, self-protective response. So I think as important as it is for people in a specific care role, it is for leaders to just be attentive to what has happened in somebody's life experience.
That's so true. Well, staff cares and leaders bring different strengths and weaknesses to the table whenever they're interacting with people. Maybe staff carers can tend to have more self-awareness about what they're bringing in of their own selves. And so tell me some things that you've seen what leaders do when they're interacting with people they're responsible for, because they're not going to be isolated from the traumatic experience. They're responsible for these people. So of course they're going to interact with them about it at some point.
Well, unless it's a childhood trauma that they don't know about, or a difficult experience they had in a previous job or career. So a leader, for example, might, let's say, be really directive. So they're telling somebody what to do and how to do it, which is certainly an acceptable style of leadership. I think in a lot of organizations, people tend to want more freedom and a little more autonomy. But if somebody has had a really difficult life experience with somebody who is really controlling, what's happening is they're going to react out of being controlled. So that means perhaps being aggressive or shutting down, disengaging, not being available to even talk to this leader who's perhaps within right, but being very directive. So that person doesn't feel safe because in their life they've had an experience where somebody really tried to control them. In almost all trauma, there's an element of loss of control. So leader just trying to do their best thing, saying, hey, I need you to go do this thing in this way. And all of a sudden this person's reacting. And the leader's like, wow, why are you reacting so strongly? And what they don't realize, and sometimes even the person doesn't realize, is that what's happening is that's actually reminding them of this time previously where they felt really, really unsafe. And now they're defensive and aggressive and in this kind of self-protect mode.
So you're talking about not just maybe a traumatic experience that has occurred recently on the field, but you're talking about cross-cultural workers who have had past traumatic experiences that maybe leadership doesn't know about, and they're interacting with them about what they may consider just normal stuff, but that could trigger something in the cross-cultural worker.
Exactly. And then we're putting cross-cultural workers in situations where they have a lot more stress. So it's more likely that they're going to be in an experience that's going to trigger some of this previous life stuff. Kind of like what I was saying earlier, in general, I think when there's an evacuation or a car wreck or an attack of some kind, we tend to be a little more attentive to caring for people well as organizations. I think we're a little less when we're responsive to somebody who's being defensive or aggressive or unhelpful. But let's back up a little bit and talk a little about trauma in case somebody hasn't listened to our trauma episode, and then we'll kind of get into ways that people behave who have trauma life experiences.
Okay, sounds good. Bessel Kolk finds trauma is not the story of something that happened back then, but the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside the individual. When I like that picture of the current imprint, it's the effect
Right.
of what happened.
And that's what trauma is. It's an experience. I think a lot of times we jump to it being a specific event. You know, when you had that car wreck, that's when you had trauma. Trauma is about how we experience an event. And all of our experiences are different. So two people can go through the same event and walk away with very different experiences based on how it was for them at that moment. But what happens is those events can leave us stuck in a state of helplessness and terror. And it changes how we perceive danger. So our brain is actually kind of rewired. Now, our brain's designed to do that. It's an adaptive thing. But what happens is what is designed to be adaptive becomes maladaptive when we're no longer experiencing trauma. So it's great if we're being chased by a lion because our brain is activated, our lower brain is in charge, fight, flight, or freeze is going, and we get to safety. The problem is our body and brain will still react that way even when we're not being chased by a lion.
So that experience leaves this footprint in you, and it changes how you perceive, how you interact with the world.
Yes, perceived danger. So imagine somebody who has had a trauma experience in their life believes that people are out to get them. So how is that on a team? If we kind of have this belief that I might be in danger, somebody might be out to get me at any time, well, that's going to really impact how they work on a team. And when their stress goes up, what happens is they are even more likely to be in this fight, flight, or freeze part of their brain.
They may not realize what's happening.
Yeah, and they may not even realize it. Another way to think about it is from the Healing the Wounds of Trauma Facilitator Guide. It says trauma is a deep wound of the heart and mind that takes a long time to heal. It hurts every part of our lives, how we relate to others, how our body feels, what we think about, and how much we can trust God. It makes us feel separated from God and others. And it can cause deep suffering that lasts a really long time. That's what we call trauma.
So you're looking at trauma, and it's hugely impactful on how an individual or like even a unit, a family unit could function. And these can be wounds that aren't really visible or known to those interacting with them. So like someone in leadership that we've talked about is interacting with someone who's experienced trauma. They don't see those wounds are there, but they don't see them.
Right. And I think a lot of times people are behaving with best intentions and are just unaware that what's happening is they're really triggering that trauma. And we know that there's ongoing impact. Like the ACE study, which I talk a lot about, adverse childhood experiences, was able to point out a correlation and cause effect with childhood trauma and adult lifehood experiences. So people that had 3 or more adverse childhood experiences, way more likely, I mean, hundreds of percent points more likely to die of heart disease, the number one killer of Americans, to have depression. So they are able to recognize ongoing adult challenges with childhood trauma, but that's true of all the trauma that we experience in life. Trauma experiences are going to create challenges for us in life, particularly if they're not dealt with. So the way people behave who have experienced trauma is, they're being triggered, and triggers anything that reminds us of a memory or an event in the past. A lot of times it's connected to senses, so sight, sound, smells. I think traditionally we think somebody that's really jumpy to a loud noise because they were in a situation where there was explosions. So we can kind of experience some of it. It's also helpful to think of the huge range of what that means. A particular smell that reminds us of something good or bad. It's why in counseling they encourage us not to wear cologne or perfume in
Mhm.
sessions, because that can really impact somebody if that smell reminds them of things.
Right, that's so true.
Yeah, be clean, don't be scented.
And the word triggered, I think it gets used a lot these days, but I think it's a really important way of describing trauma and how things can evoke responses, neurological responses.
Right. And it's automatic, and a lot of times we're not aware of it.
Right.
Sometimes we have a physiological response to a trigger. So a certain experience. So an example would be, I had a motorcycle wreck when I lived in Kenya. And now the rapid slowing of any vehicle, my heart starts beating faster. I get a little
Mm.
sweaty, probably my eyes dilate. So my body's having a response to that experience that now was many, many years ago.
So a lot of times our responses, it sounds like they're not in our control. Maybe we're not even aware of them happening.
Right. And that would make sense. You're in a car, somebody's slowing down quickly. So we can say, yeah, that fits. But what if the trauma experience was as a kid with an abusive father or uncle, or as a young adult with a really unhelpful supervisor at your first job? So now what's happening is you're in a work situation, and all of a sudden this person's reacting. Their heart's beating faster, they're sweating, their brain's putting them in fight, flight, or freeze mode, but they're not actually in danger. And because of that, a lot of times people are responding in perhaps ways that aren't fitting with how we see most people responding in that similar situation.
And these people tend to get labeled as difficult or not easy to work with. And a lot of this is because we don't know their full story.
Right. And for the staff care person, they're coming alongside somebody because something has happened. Usually either they've reached out, or their boss has said, you need to talk to somebody, or they're really struggling in a cross-cultural situation because stress is a lot higher.
Mm-hmm.
So what were coping strategies that worked in their home context aren't working anymore, or they don't have access to them. So
Right.
like a woman living in a context where she can't go outside for a run, or can't go to a fitness class that was really good for her because she doesn't have access to it, has lost perhaps one of her really significant coping strategies.
And aside from that, I think aside from those specific examples of living cross culturally, just the act of living cross culturally raises our stress levels.
Yeah, all the time.
So you're
And
going to have less margin to cope no matter what.
exactly. And then perhaps loss of some of your normal coping thing. And I think a lot of times people do some unhealthy stuff to cope, whether it's, drinking, pornography, potentially drug use. I think the more common one is actually work. So people actually use work as a coping strategy. I'm not really comfortable with life, or I'm struggling to emotionally connect, to decompress. So I'm just going to work until I'm so tired I go to sleep. It's the normalized addictive behavior.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
We usually get rewarded for it.
Yep.
In general, people who've had trauma experiences are getting self-protective. So Brene Brown uses the word armoring up, which I really
Mm.
like. And the world's out to get me. I'm not safe. The brain's responding. It even happens in marriages for couples who are living cross-culturally. All of this added stress, added work, and now the little things, people are really responding to perhaps really slight interactions, more angry, more hurt, more sensitive. Shame, I think, a lot of times is a piece of that. Almost all trauma has elements of shame, whether
Mm.
it's shame about how we feel because somebody did something to us, or shame about how we behaved in a certain situation. I wish I would have done more. I wish I would have helped or been available, or wish it was me and not them. There's heavy elements of shame. And I think a lot of times we get defensive out of shame.
And there can be shame with having triggers and responding to trauma and like, why is this happening to me? Why am I so jumpy? And we maybe should on ourselves and feel like I shouldn't be responding this way to something
Right.
that had happened years ago.
So true. So now we're like doubling down on the shame because in moments where I haven't been my best self, I usually don't feel great about that. Self-aware enough to know, oh, I shouldn't have been like that.
Yeah.
So now there's just one more thing to feel shame about.
Right. And it spirals.
Yeah. And as our brain's reacting, we are really disconnecting from our thinking brain, which is really important. It's our prefrontal cortex, memory storage, decision making. It really gets shut down. So we're in either hyper arousal or hypo arousal, that fight, flight, or freeze part of our body.
Yeah.
We've talked about the window of tolerance before. I'll post a link to it, but it's just a way of noticing that people with trauma, their window of tolerance shrinks and it's easier to get out of it. So hyper arousal is, anxiety, panic, overwhelmed, unable to relax. So fight or flight. Hypo arousal is freezing, shutting down, depression, poor digestion, disconnecting from people. And I think when we're under a lot of stress, our window of tolerance shrinks too. So lowered frustration tolerance, really easily angry or upset.
So you're saying someone who has experienced trauma has a lower window of tolerance anyway.
Right.
And then if they're living cross culturally, that window of tolerance is probably going to shrink even more.
Very tiny.
Okay. And so you do often see these hyper arousal or hypo arousal responses from them.
I think about yourself. Like I can think had a lot of travel in the last month, and there's a time where I was really tired and things weren't, let's just say, progressing as one would expect in travel, delays, in that moment, I can recognize, oh, I'm a little out of my window of tolerance, right? A little agitated, a little angry. I need to calm. I need to get back into control. Sometimes just being really tired. I'm struggling to focus, struggling to concentrate, right? Those kinds of things. Or I'm starting to get disconnected, extra sleepy, extra distracted. And it's actually because I'm kind of chronically tired, not just because I'm jet lagged. So window of tolerance impacts all of us. If you've ever been really angry at your kids, you're actually out of your window of tolerance just like they are. You've had teenagers. You know.
And when you're both acting out of your window of tolerance, it's fantastic. Let me just tell you.
Yeah. I'm often, especially with teenagers, encouraging parents to get out of the situation so that they get back into their window of tolerance, because you can't have two emotionally dysregulated individuals having a successful confrontation.
Oh my gosh. Did I tell you, have I used this before? Someone said, like, let them be on that roller coaster and you just stand on the platform and wave at them, be like, I'll see you.
That's
I'll
right.
see you when you get back.
They'll be
That helped me
back.
so much. Yeah, that helped me so much. Like, I don't have to
Don't.
be on the roller coaster screaming
No.
also.
Right.
So, wondering what it's like when we're interacting with someone who's out of their window of tolerance. Does it tend to drag us out of our own window of tolerance too? Like, do we have to be really aware of where we are?
It depends on the circumstance. If it's a care oriented thing, you're probably extra attentive to them and to yourself. If you're just out in normal life and they're getting really agitated, it might take you out of yours. I was working with a client this summer, trauma history, and I'm talking about things that he needed to change, and I'm actually watching him get disconnected. So he's out of his window of tolerance. He's shutting down. His eyes are actually getting a little like sleepy. He's leaning back. His posture becomes like sleepy. I'm like, he is no longer with me in the present. I've also had people who are telling their trauma stories who get out of their window of tolerance and are hyper arousal. They're fidgety, they're shaking, they're tapping. And part of care, and we're going to get into trauma informed care, is actually to help people to process their experience, which is something that happened in the past, and that's the imprint of it, but also to stay in the present. And that's the challenge for the person that's caring. It's good for them to process their story. It helps integrate what has been a very disintegrating experience. Our memories aren't stored well in trauma because our brain is now operating from the bottom to the top. So our limbic system, hippocampus, is actually storing memories in an unhelpful way. So part of what telling our story does is integrate that memory into a healthier pattern. But to do so, we need to be in our window of tolerance and in the present.
We've talked about trauma and just how it affects people. It can sound a little bit scary and overwhelming knowing that we're going to interact with someone who has experienced trauma, and just kind of knowing what they bring with them can feel a little bit overwhelming. But there are really good, healthy ways to interact with people who've experienced trauma. So let's talk about that.
Right. It's recoverable. We can heal from our trauma experiences. So trauma informed care has really come out of the medical field. Hospitals and clinics are like, oh, wait, some of the ways we behave is really triggering people with trauma experiences. And what I've done is taken some of those principles and applied it to our cross-cultural organizations. So trauma-informed care is about recognizing presence of trauma symptoms and shifting from asking what's wrong with you to what's happened. I think a lot of times we're like, you are really behaving in a way that I don't understand. What is wrong with you? But it's really shifting to, hang on a second, something's happened because you're behaving in that way to try to meet your needs. And I can see that's actually not a good way to get those needs met. So I want to know how I can help meet those needs in a way that's safer for everybody.
When does it ever work to say, what's wrong with you?
Yeah. It's like saying we need to talk. Nobody responds well to that.
Nobody likes that. But when you enter into a conversation with wanting to know what happened, it's like you're communicating, I want to know you.
Right.
And I want to know what's motivating you instead of what's on the surface that I find irritating. I think that's what's maybe being communicated is like you're really irritating to me.
Right. Or
Stop
to
it.
somebody. And it's the trying to get the surface thing is what's wrong. Like it's behavior.
Yes.
We're trying to get to what's happened, a little bit of what's under the surface. So key principles to trauma informed care is trauma awareness, which is what we've been doing, recognizing trauma, how it impacts people, how people behave out of that. Second one is safety. Third one is choice and empowerment. Fourth one is strength-based approach. And then finally, it's defined roles and making good referrals. And we'll kind of dig into each of these.
The trauma
So,
awareness.
right. It's what we've been doing. It's what is trauma? It's about experience, not events. How does it impact people? They get self-protective. They're trying to get their needs met. And what we're doing is we're being aware of it. So, hey, that behavior makes me think something's happened to this person. I want to be able to speak into that. Psychological first aid is a type of care designed in disaster response. Really basic stuff about making somebody feel safe and supporting them.
Yeah.
And once again, I think we do that well. There's been an earthquake. We're going to come in. We're going to do psychological first aid. Some of those principles are actually just good all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Helping meet
Yeah.
practical needs. What are the needs and concerns? Care, listening to people, not pressuring them to talk, comforting people, helping them feel calm, helping them be in their window of tolerance. This is actually just really good stuff all the time. Protecting people from further harm. Trauma informed care is really about avoiding triggers. So that doesn't mean loading, not just covering yourself in Axe body spray, because that has terrible memories of middle school for everybody. That's also a good thing to do. Let's just avoid coating yourself in Axe body spray in general. But
Just full stop.
yeah, it's avoiding other kinds of triggers like taking control away from a person.
Maybe
Great.
asking too many questions, like being so
Yeah.
hyper
Yeah. Inquisitive.
inquisitive.
Second part of it is safety. Once again, we think safety in somebody who's just been through a hurricane, getting into a building that's not going to fall down. But actually, safety is more about physical safety. It's also about psychological safety. How can we make somebody feel safe in an organization? So for the staff care provider, that's mitigating power differentials.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit.
Different organizations have different structure on where staff care fits. Like, is it administrative or is it not? Is it under HR or is it just coming alongside people? Are there reports that are done? Those are the kinds of things. I think talking about them helps reduce some of potential for power differentials. Perhaps we need to have them connect with somebody outside the organization so that they feel safer. They can bring somebody into the session, maybe a spouse or a friend. Some of these opportunities that make them feel safer. Let them choose a spot. Is it in your house or maybe you don't want to be in your house? Can we go out for coffee?
Giving them as much agency as you can to have some control over the situation, who they talk to, and what situations or what environment they're in.
Right. And that's really the next one too, choice and empowerment. Other things for safety, sometimes we can actually lead in with vulnerability. So a little bit of shared experience, living into our values, it creates a safer space to be vulnerable. Wow, I know what that's like. I've had really difficult experiences with coworkers, and I bet that's really hard. A little bit of vulnerability helps create a sense of safety. Or if the conversation is confidential, don't promise it if it's not, to say, hey, what we're going to talk about is going to stay between us. That creates safety. Definitely don't lie. And I would encourage you not to use confidentiality if that's not within your job description. As a counselor, it always is. And that's why counseling a lot of times is a safe place for people to process difficult experiences.
I think that could be one of the worst things is to tell someone this conversation will be confidential, then have to go back and say, actually,
Just kidding.
no. Gosh, that would be awful.
Or even worse, don't go back and tell them. And instead, that information gets communicated to other people.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make people feel safe.
I think leading with vulnerability is really good. I think there's a line we have to be aware of. Not sharing so much about ourselves that it becomes more about us than about the person we're relating to, also.
Right. It's not time to share your story, but to share, I've had a similar experience. When I was in school, I think they talked about a counselor sharing what we call that self disclosure,
Mm-hmm.
being careful with it, using it like a credit card. You have it. You certainly don't want to use it all the time. This is before points were a thing.
Mm.
So,
When you
oh,
wanted to use it
yeah,
all the
that's
time.
right. All metaphors have limitations, but it's an opportunity for connection with experience. The reason I live overseas is because it puts me in a position that is more accessible to people, both physically, I'm closer to where they're living, but also psychologically. There's a sense that they come in knowing that I get their experience. I don't have to share that. They know. My bio says I've lived overseas for the last 12 years. There's a sense of like, I know this person gets my experience.
Something along with that. Maybe it goes with mitigating power differentials, but being willing to say or listen to the other person and say, hey, actually, I'd feel comfortable talking to someone else. And it's important to support that and support that agency that they have.
And that's a perfectly reasonable request that sometimes
Yes.
people are afraid to make themselves. And then sometimes it costs. That's just money well spent as an organization. Like if you need to pay for somebody to have counseling outside the org, great. Figure out how to build that into your system.
All right. So now we're thinking about choice and empowerment. Talk about that some.
So much of trauma has elements of control and choice being taken away.
Mm-hmm.
So any ways we can help people have some agency is really helpful. So that might be, do you want to meet with me or somebody in a different organization? Would you rather be at your house or go to coffee? A little bit of choice. And I think I see leaders in particular do both things where they remove a lot of choice and it's too overwhelming for people to have all of the options. Like what do you need is sometimes too overwhelming for people struggling. I don't know. If I knew what I needed, I would have got it already. But
So
also being
sometimes,
too directive is it can be cause people to shut down. You're just telling me what to do and you're not listening to what I need.
so giving some direction, but also giving them some choices to help them to not feel overwhelmed, but also know that they have some control over how they tell their story and their experience.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
so well worded. It is about even agency and who they tell their story to and how they share it.
Because their stories are so vulnerable. Like it's such a huge part of who they are, and they want to feel like they have some control on how that gets out.
Right. And I think as people on the field are struggling, sometimes they need to go back to their home country for whatever reason. And I think there's a lot of shame connected to that. It might be the right thing to do for their health and the health of the people that they work with. Because somebody who's really having trauma triggers and is reacting out of that self-protective armored up sense, probably difficult for the people around them and costly as people are trying to care for them. It might be the right move, but there's so much shame around it. Like having agency and telling one's story is really important.
Oh my gosh, yes. And not feeling like I've told you my story, and then the next day you hear, oh, actually, you guys need to go home. And
Right.
that might be something that needs to happen, but it needs to happen in a more sensitive manner than like, oh, I've just been vulnerable to you and now I'm getting punished for that.
Right. Because that's not going to make people feel safe. But
No.
looking for ways that they can have choice and empowering them in those choices, like this day or that day, or this way or that way, or how can we help you? Here's some options. I know this is hard. Part of it's changing the golden rule. Like we've gotten it wrong. What's the golden rule?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Right. We need to love our neighbors as they would want to be loved. Like if I'm a big hugger, which I'm actually not, but it's a good example. And I'm like, oh, I need to love people how I want to be loved. I'm going to hug everybody. Well, what's that like for somebody who's had really difficult experiences of physical interactions with people, particularly men? And I'm a big guy. So that would be horrible. So I need to treat people in a way that they want to be treated. So, I tend to, it's particularly because I lived in North Africa with physical interactions, I just sit back and let other people initiate. But we need to be really careful how we can interact with people who are responding to trauma, giving them choice, empowering them in little things. Like I think sometimes in Christian circles we jump to prayer. Oh, can I pray for you? I mean, who says no to that, right? But even how we use spirituality, being very careful to allow people to choose what they want and when they want it, and then
Oh,
empowering them
yes.
in those choices.
Right. Because I think a lot of times trauma can bring about some really heavy spiritual questions, which is fine.
Right.
And it could be really necessary to your whole process. But if the listener is spiritualizing it in a way that shuts down the person dealing with trauma, that's not good.
Yeah. And spiritual formation is happening in trauma. Like we can't go through
Yes.
trauma and not be formed by it. But I think for particularly the staff care person, it's important to give people control in their experience and to be careful how we use those opportunities in spiritual formation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm giving a seminar called The Integration of Spiritual Formation with a Traumatized Client in mental health admissions in a couple months.
Ooh.
So we might have to cycle back to this.
Oh, I'd really like to. I would, whenever I've talked with people, I've let them lead with how they want to bring spirituality into the conversation.
Right.
It's not my job to lead with that because I don't know all of their relationship to that and how they're working through things and struggling with things.
Right. And in counseling, there is a power differential. I am coming in as the counselor, the expert. In staff care, we can lower some of that because it's not you're not coming in with this clinical kind of setting where there is more of a power differential. It's just worth noting. I even pay attention to like the chairs that are in a room when I'm meeting with people. If one's higher than the other, I try not to always sit in a higher one because it creates this psychological power differential that is there. Also, being kind of a bigger guy, I'm just aware of if I'm talking to somebody, a lot of times I'll sit down or even half sit on something. Just being aware of some of those things helps people feel a little more empowered and a little bit less out of control. So next we have a strength-based approach. And I think this is really, really important for the staff care person is to
Mhm.
say, let's really focus on strengths. There's probably some weaknesses that have led to this interaction, right? Either their behavior or something that was going on that has led them to not cope well. For the staff care person, let's really focus on their strengths in our interactions. We're trying to coach, not counseling. Let's refer them to counseling to work on some of that stuff. So helping people find the best solutions for themselves. For people that have made it to living overseas in a company or an organization, they've got a lot of great coping skills or they wouldn't have made it that far. So it's about, ideally, it's about noticing those and saying, hey, what has worked for you in the past? How have you dealt with this
Yes.
difficult thing in the past? When you had somebody you struggled to work with previously, what were ways that you navigated that?
Mhm.
So not prescriptive, not one size fits all. It's collaborative, but it's really about helping them notice what they've been good at and affirming them. So this is really against shame. So shame is any feeling of selflessness, of self-worthlessness, any feelings of worthlessness. I'm not good enough. I'm a bad worker, husband, father, son, whatever it is. Those are elements of shame. When people are shoulding, like I should be better at this, that's shameful. I'm not good enough. I
Mhm.
should have learned this language by now. I'm a terrible language learner. That's shame. So it's really about encouraging them and giving them anti-shame messages. So it's about identity, about who they are, about ways they've been successful in the past. And it's lowering some of the need for armor because you're
Mhm.
just noticing, hey, you've got tools in your toolbox. Let's pull those out and let's use them. And then normalizing and affirming, normalizing, hey, this is actually a really difficult thing. And it's okay for it to be difficult and you to be struggling, and I'm here to help.
I like what you said before, one of our podcasts, where so often you say to people, I'd be surprised if you didn't feel
Yeah.
this way in this situation. But
It would be way weirder for you to be normal because this isn't a normal thing.
right, I think it really helps people to see, like, okay, this situation is really hard. What I've been through is really hard. And it helps them to step out of the stance of self protectiveness into a more proactive stance and being able to move forward.
Yeah, you sold everything you owned. You lived in your car for 6 months. You moved overseas to a new location where you didn't know anybody and didn't speak the language. You got there, and the job you thought you were coming to do doesn't exist anymore. So now you're doing something you don't feel particularly qualified or equipped for in the
Mhm.
midst of trying to settle your family and figure out language and work and culture. And yeah, that's actually all really hard.
Just really hard. You think you
That's
just offended your neighbor, but you don't know what you did.
yeah, that's that's actually hard.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, it really
makes
is.
sense for you not to be in your best self all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, last one. Trauma informed care is really knowing what your role is and how to make referrals. In this moment, is your person you're caring for actually the team and the organization? Because it's possible that there's a conflicting thing there, right? Caring for an individual struggling might come at the cost of the team that they're on if they stay there. But if you're meant to be caring for the whole team, then you might need to be helping that individual move on to a different place or a different job. And so it's really knowing, who am I caring for? What is my role? Am I in an administrative role or caring role?
And what do you do if leadership or admin have different ideas or goals that they want to impose on you as you're meeting with this person?
Yeah, can you fix this person?
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly, you have to know, what is my role and who is my client? Is my client administration?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually helping them navigate this situation, or is the person I'm caring for this individual? Being really clear, and being clear with all of those people. Hey, actually, I can't have daily meetings with you because you're the leader of this person I'm caring for. That's hard for me and confusing for them. Talk to them. I think that's really important. And then making referrals. So maybe you're not the best person because you're too far in it. You're actually married to the team leader and living in the same city as this person, or it gets really complicated in these cross-cultural organizations where we all work together and live together, and
oh my gosh,
we're both work colleagues and friends, and then let's not talk about work when we're just being friends. And
yeah. Well, when my husband was the director of one of the service groups and organization, it's like I could not do staff care for that service group because I wanted them to have freedom to talk to someone if they needed to about my husband. That wasn't the person for that.
Nope. Yeah, that team leader is a total jerk. You mean my husband? Yes. That goes back to power differential. Even if it doesn't exist, as in you're not going to talk to him about stuff, that people feel that.
Yeah, they do. I think too, like as cross-cultural workers, we all have multi-layered relationships. So we can't really escape that. But I think it's really helpful to know how many layers are here and can I really step into this objectively or in a helpful way, or am I really the right person for this person because they're seeing all these layers of relationship and they're not going to be comfortable with it.
And most people in staff care have their own potentially traumatic experiences with people and situations and places. So there are some times where actually your situation is way too close to something I've experienced, and that makes me not the right person.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to want to tell too much of my experience. That's where we're overdoing the vulnerability lens and now putting them in a position to care for us. And part of that self-care, like in all of this, it's important, I think, to be aware of what the cost is for us caring for people. Sometimes we make referrals because that's part of us making sure that we're taken care of, being mindful of things like compassion fatigue. Check our last podcast. There we go. So, trauma-informed care in a nutshell.
James, do you have any resources?
Hey, the Essentials for People Care and Development. A new book edited by Heather Pupils and Jeff Whiteman.
This is the book you wrote?
I wrote a chapter in this book. Okay. I in no way wrote this book. Highly recommend chapter 4, Trauma-Informed Staff Care. Although you can probably skip that chapter if you've listened to this podcast.
This is good stuff, James.
Thanks.
All right, thanks for joining us.
All right, see you next time. Were any of your kids involved?
No.
Oh, good. Okay.
Are you surprised? No. Covey. Dang it! Every time with your name, I just gonna say it a lot of different ways.
Brandy, listen. This is a rough start. It's gonna be a lot of editing. Go Gen X. You're doing great.
My Gen X is showing.
Yes, it is.